I'm actually in the old 19th century curator's office of the Rotunda, which is now a learning store. So it's nice to be in this historic setting and have the opportunity to introduce Andrew Jays, who we're delighted to have with us from the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. And Andrew's going to be talking about oysters and eelgrass on the Yorkshire coast. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Andrew, and we all very much look forward to hearing your talk. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. I am recovering from a bit of a bad cold, so occasionally there may be the occasional break while I take a glass of water or I lose my voice, so just be aware of that. And I will have to turn my camera off while I'm doing the PowerPoint presentation, purely because I don't have very good signal where I am at the moment. But I will start it up now. I can share my screen, which I can. Right, okay, so I've just got a brief talk today on oysters and eelgrass on the Yorkshire coast, talking about the evolution, the decline, and the restoration of them as well. So this is it's a conversation basically on those things. So the ancient and recent history of those two important species, the implications of their decline for us and their conservation. My role within the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust is leading these two projects to sort of a pre-designed set of targets to drive the restoration of the two really crucial habitats. I have a really, really long job title because these are actually two separate projects. So I've kind of split the presentation into sort of two distinct groups, basically. And the first one that I'm going to talk about is the oysters. And always best to start on exactly what these things are that we're talking about. So what is an oyster? They are bivalve mollusks, and that is a description of, they are basically animals which have a soft body enclosed by two shells, hinged so it can open and close as needed to feed while still protecting the animal. There are roughly 200 species of oyster worldwide, so really cosmopolitan range. They range from shallow sublittoral, intertidal, right to really deep sea as well, and more or less all over the world. It's not just the oysters that we talk about either. It is the habitat they form, which is classed as a reef. There's a lovely example on that photo there of an oyster reef. So it's a really complex 3D structure made up of generations of oysters growing upon the shells of each other, up to hundreds of thousands to millions of individuals in the reefs. They can get absolutely enormous. Our only species we have in the UK is the flat oyster, or the European oyster, or the edible oyster. It's Ostrea edulis. There is a small range map just in that bottom corner of the sort of the typical environs that it's usually found in. As you can see, sort of Europe-wide, we do have a significant amount in the North Sea and around the UK itself as well. So going into ancient history, a little disclaimer here, I'm certainly no expert in this. My specialism revolves around keeping them alive as opposed to their evolutionary history. But here we go, it's been an education for me, certainly. The date there, so 200 to 250 million years ago, evolution of the family Ostridae, which oysters sits at the start of the Triassic era, so like I say, around about 250 million years ago. Interestingly, back then they were, well, the earliest ones that have been found were epizoans. So epizoans are basically animals that encrust on other animals. In this case, they grew on amanid. I'm just going to get a laser pointer up, I believe. So in this area here, is the remains of a fossilized oyster on the edge of an amanid. More interestingly than that, though, they could be significantly older. Fossils with unidentified epizoa on them, which could potentially be oysters, but oysters actually don't fossilize very well. It's only a very small part of them that does fossilize, so it is tricky to pick them up in the fossil record. This is the earliest example of a confirmed oyster. There could be more out there. Persistent is probably the best word I can think of for oysters. So they've enjoyed a really nice niche throughout history. They're prolific, they create their own environment with the reefs they form, so they've been resilient through mass extinctions that have crippled other lineages. Their form hasn't changed much either. The simplicity of their anatomy means they have essentially a water pump to bring food and water into the shell, muscle to control when that shell opens, and reproductive organs. They are animals, but they haven't even got a central nervous system, so they are not actually classed as sentient. They're as basic as it gets, really, and the requirements are likewise very basic as well. So all this has led to them being a very, very successful group of animals. Skipping a few million years now into basically sort of a Mesolithic, Neolithic times. The importance of oysters in recent history is, for sustenance, it's really, really difficult to overstate the effect oysters have had on our early history. These animals were basically the first fast food. They required no expenditure of energy to collect. They're a food source that doesn't move and it self-replenishes given the chance. They're incredibly rich in vitamins and minerals, particularly zinc and B12, which means that if you are on a more of a plant-based diet and you aren't able to hunt, you still have key vitamins that are missing in that sort of diet. And they're an incredible source of protein as well. Also, sort of linking the fact that they are basically risk-free, hunting doesn't really require much fighting back from them at all. We have found evidence of oysters being consumed in Britain as far back as 8,700 BC. That evidence is in the form of these middens, the ancient human habitation. So that's still why we were still connected to mainland Europe. If you consider the island we know as Britain, the coastal areas have always been significant in size, and only within a few days' walk of even the driest parts of the landmass. So it's not really much surprise that humans drift towards the sort of the easy pickings, if you like, of the coast. Economically, oysters have got a really strange place in our social history. They're one of the oldest forms of aquaculture. So historically, the first oysters were farmed around 1 BC by the Roman Empire. They were considered a delicacy. Loads and loads of our flat oysters were shipped back to Rome. But more recently, going into Edwardian Victorian times, they were actually thought to be a staple of the working class, particularly in England, as there's such a cheap and accessible food source. But now they've actually gone past that, and they've actually a resurgence almost to delicacy status, which is sort of slowly waning again at staple diet ideals. A lot of this is partly thanks to farming oysters. They're extremely accessible to most, but they're still quite an exotic food item, if not quite a luxury one. Just a little note as well on the amount of oysters that are farmed. So it's about 95% of oysters that are consumed today are farmed. So it's really, really big business. That's about $7.5 billion worldwide. Just a note here as well, this photo is actually our oyster reintroduction site at Spurn Point. I'm regretting not putting it later down the line when I actually talk about the oyster site at Spurn Point, but it gives you an idea of how these oysters are farmed, basically, which is mesh bags on trestles. The environmental importance, now this is obviously not something that's just from recent history, but it's one of those things that you don't know what you've got till it's gone situation. So only the fact that we understand its importance is in the recent history. So as stated already, oysters form reefs, so they make fantastic habitat for these countless animals, which we also benefit from. So they also basically provide a habitat for young fish that we may then go into a fisheries context. It gives a welcome boost to biodiversity in regions where reefs exist. To give an example, our flat oysters, they can be right at the bottom of the intertidal range down to about 60 meters. So really wide range of conditions, giving a chance for a huge variety of organisms to benefit. And that goes into the ecosystem services side of it as well. So ecosystem services are sort of the mainly varied benefits to humans provided by the natural environment and from healthy ecosystems specifically. In this case, the most significant one is the ability of oysters to clean our waters. As oysters are an obligate filter feeder, they have no choice but to take in their food with other items as well. And this can include all sorts of small particulates and sediments. These then get flocculated together and released by the oyster as pseudofeces, which basically means that rather than floating around in the water column, they bind and form substrate around the reefs, having the effect of both cleaning the water and allowing more light to penetrate. That, coupled with the oysters utilising some agricultural pollutants in their growth, has the effect of reducing eutrophication events, making our coastal waters far healthier, which for an island is absolutely critical to our health as well. I really don't like to talk too much on doom and gloom side, so I've put a really nice photo of a stunning oyster reef here. This is exactly what an oyster reef should look like, absolutely chock full of biodiversity. The stats that are on screen now put things a little bit in perspective for why oyster restoration is such an important aspect of current conservation, marine conservation. Now, just because I haven't worded this particularly brilliantly looking at it, the 85% is all species of oysters worldwide. So that's total amount of oysters worldwide that have been lost. And the flat oysters that are our native species, that stat is the decline in the UK. Europe-wide, it's about 90%. So we echo more or less around the world the same sort of decline. I've put the second two stats up because it does help put the first two in perspective. These are incredibly rare habitats and they are declining. Rainforests and coral reefs get a huge amount of focus when we talk about conservation. Oysters might not be the prettiest animals, but they are incredibly important. You know, they're not full of charismatic megafauna like rainforests. They're not in sunlit tropical waters like coral reefs, but they are in decline. They are important and do need our help. Just quick point on the reasons for decline. Generally human caused, unfortunately. Overexploitation, decline in water quality, habitat loss around native ranges, invasive non-native species and diseases, which sort of moved around the world by us. This is an example of one invasive non-native, which is slipper limpet. They basically outcompete our native oysters for space. Right, so just coming into our efforts a little bit, we're working at the Humber Estuary on the Spurn Point Nature Reserve for the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. This once had a reef that posed a hazard to shipping. That's how large it was. Disappeared in the mid-1900s. A couple of reasons here: overexploitation and declining water quality are mostly to blame. With the advent of better aquaculture techniques and improved water quality, it's sort of high time to bring these back to the estuary in big numbers. So we recognise an area of Spurn Point that would give us the benefits of basically the North Sea's clean waters, fully saline waters, but also the protection of the head from significant storm events. 2018 to 2020, these were the years where it was sort of the start of the introduction project to oysters. A small number of adults were brought in from Stranraer in Scotland and placed in bags on trestles like we saw on the slide earlier in the low intertidal range. The main reason for this was to ensure that the oysters could in fact live in the waters of the estuary. We carried out water tests that basically indicated that yes, they would be absolutely fine. But information on paper sometimes doesn't transfer to what is in reality. So we just wanted to basically double check with a small number of individuals. This portion of the project was a success. Survivorship was very good. We learned a great deal about farming oysters in the process. And we decided to increase the scope of that project in 2021 by introducing the other side of the life cycle in the form of oyster seed from an oyster hatchery at Morecambe Bay. We were confident of survivorship, so now we wanted to see young oysters growing. So 100,000 young oysters later, we can say that they do. We've had really nice success with our seed, growing by about threefold in weight so far and quadrupling in size with a lot of them, with a little bit of the growing season still to go. Just a little bit of explanation on this picture here. The original size of the seed was from this point here to the second A. So quite significant levels of growth there. The future of the project is basically now trying to convince these oysters to form their own reefs by siting them on oyster culture, which is basically the substrate that they grow on within the boxes. They're already providing that really nifty ecosystem service of cleaning the water. And through that, we're seeing really good numbers of animals like sand eel, which much prefer cleaner water. They are utilizing the oyster site more and more now as well. So we're going on to the second focus of this talk now, which is the seagrass side of things. So again, best place to start is exactly what is seagrass. A marine angiosperm is basically a marine flowering plant. There are only three distinct groups that could be defined as such. That's seagroves, mangroves, and salt marsh. The easiest way to go over the anatomy of a seagrass plant is to think of a spider plant where they have a central rhizome, which is here. From that, you will get occasional roots going down into the substrate, and you will get nodes which grow sort of at regular intervals along the rhizome. Each of these nodes grows a blade or a leaf or a frond, depending on how you would like to term it. And it's from these nodes that the flowers then develop and produce seeds, which you can see here from the pilot project we ran last year. The flowers here look quite impressive. They're really not. I'm sorry to say they are quite dull looking. This is because they just don't have to be impressive. They've never relied on pollinators. So unlike terrestrial plants, evolutionary, there's never been a factor of needing to be attractive to pollinators in any way. Just note as well, it's not just seed germination that is responsible for reproduction of seagrasses. They do have part to play with clonal growth, where the rhizome produces new nodes. If a section is broken off, that is still a viable plant for all intents and purposes. And of the species we're working with, which is Dwarf Eelgrass, the rhizomes can get to about a meter long. There's 50 species over 12 genera. It is around that number. There's been a lot of work in the past couple of decades around seagrass genetics, and the number of species is still in this sort of contested state of flux. It's probably safe to say there's about a 20% uncertainty about where the true number lies. So I've picked the median to mention here. But it is interesting to note at this point that over half of all seagrass species come from just 3 of those 12 genera, which I believe are Halophylla, Zostera, and I think Posidonia, which would imply these 3 appeared very early in seagrass evolution, which is why they've just diversified that much more. Like oysters, they create their own habitat. So I've got to mention the meadows here. This is what excites us most about seagrass. Not so much the individual plants, but the meadows that all of the individuals create. They can reach many hectares in size in a lot of cases. I think the largest is in the Indian Ocean. It's about the size of Switzerland. The reason seagrass meadows excite us is because their amazing level of biodiversity, which is about 30 times more within meadows than adjacent bare substrate. They've also got a fantastic ability to sequester carbon, which is helping fight against the effects of human-made climate change. So another note on seagrass evolution. Speaking of evolution, again, a little disclaimer. I know a little more about seagrass evolution than oyster evolution, but I still won't consider myself an expert. It's also a field where a large amount of information is still missing. Seagrass doesn't fossilize well. So this is where archaeology looks at not just fossilizations, but also current plant distributions, ecosystem effects, so that evidence of seagrass can be recognized amongst other finds, even if it's not the plants themselves that you are finding. Now, the small size of the seagrass flora could be considered an indicator of recent origin. In fact, seagrasses are only a little younger evolutionary than oysters, only by about 100 million years or so. They evolved from terrestrial plants and found that really nice niche where they could survive in salt water. Just note here, there are freshwater plants in the world that can tolerate salt water. These are not seagrasses. They are just salt-tolerant freshwater. Because of the low dispersal, we don't see much diversity with seagrasses. They all have more or less the same form. They have really low dispersal because the seas just do not travel very far at all. They also have a very, very high mortality rate when they are at the seed stage. And any clonal growth generally is restricted to within a few meters of the plant. In general, the biogeography of seagrasses suggests that these organisms evolved successfully in the Tethys Sea of the late Cretaceous. However, the modern division in sort of two groups, the temperate and the tropical, tends to suggest that at some point an ecological separation occurred in both the northern and southern hemispheres. Unfortunately, back to a bit more doom and gloom, which I'll get out of as quick as possible. So seagrass is in decline quite extensively, unfortunately, within UK boundaries. 92% reduction in cover in the UK is absolutely atrocious compared to the rest of the world, which is only about 29%. We only have 2 species in the UK, Zostera marina and Zostera noltia, which are basically dwarf eelgrass and eelgrass, respectively. No prizes for guessing the difference between the two. There are lots of individual reasons why seagrass is in decline, but they all kind of fall under broad categories. So 4 broad categories mainly. The highest effect is decline in water quality. Seagrass like sunlit, clear waters. So any years where we have large blooms of plankton, algae, bacteria due to heavy nitrate and phosphate runoffs, for example, will lead to bad years for our seagrass as they won't be able to photosynthesize. This excessive richness of nutrients, so eutrophication, even if the level isn't high enough to affect the seagrass directly and poison it, the water becomes so hospitable to the algae and the plants just get smothered. So even if it's a case of there isn't enough light going down, it just means that they may have more epiphytic algae growing on them. Further to this, also industrial pollution causes an issue. So heavy metals directly prevent plants from fixing nitrogen, particularly lead. So in heavily industrialized areas, this is an extra pressure to take into account. Now, we are working in the Humber Estuary again on Spurn Point with Dwarf Eelgrass, which as a water body has a basin size of over 24,000 square kilometres. It drains areas as far away as Leicester. That's about 20% of the land area in England. So there can be a huge amount of pollution coming through that quite narrow passageway, really, when you think about it. However, again, in past 30 years ago, so the Humber has cleaned up quite a bit. The second sort of main reason for decline is wasting disease, which is this here. Between wasting disease and decline of water quality, that makes up about half of the decline of all seagrass. This has had a significant effect on one of our 2 species, Zostera marina. Okay, well, in the UK and North Atlantic, it's wiped out about 90% of the population. It's caused by a pathogen called Labyrinthula zostera. I say that slightly differently every time I read it. The major outbreak was at the beginning of 1900s, so about 1920s or so. The vast majority of some of those areas haven't recovered, to the point where some have simply become completely bare of it. The disease, well, the pathogen, is actually found worldwide, and it does have a job in breaking down old dead leaves. The problem occurs where there's another stressor. So, for example, declining water quality, or if there's a high temperature, weather events, basically the plant stresses, the pathogen can break through the epidermis of the live plant and it begins to kill the host. You start to see these as black areas on the leaves, like here, and as soon as it bisects the entire leaf, that plant is then dead. It cannot get the nutrient exports and oxygen that it requires. Coastal modification is a really broad, but it's certainly worth mentioning. We humans like the coast. Our economy, welfare, calorie intake, reliant on it in many cases. For every new development on a sheltered, muddy or sandy shore, we have to consider, are we encroaching on an appropriate habitat for seagrass? This doesn't have to be a direct effect either. If you consider what happens when we build groins on beaches, they are specifically designed to change the deposition of sand and silt to the area. And they can affect areas much further down the coast, 50, 60 miles or so away. A great deal of this modification has already happened. And we do believe that this is partly responsible for the inability of the meadows that we are currently working with to restore, to naturally recolonize, basically. We've got three very large ports within the Humber at Hull, Grimsby and Immingham. So you can see this is an area which has in the past been heavily modified. One other last point is direct damage. I mean, this can have so many forms, it'd be impossible to list them all. Basically, anything that physically damages the plant or the substrate is direct damage. In the UK, anchor scouring around marinas has been very well studied, and this is the photo you can see in the picture. So basically, as the tide ebbs and flows, the boat is moved back and forth, and the chain is dragged over a narrow strip of meadow, preventing any seed settlement or any clonal growth from the rhizome. Other forms of direct damage can be things like dredging, but again, this is sort of linked in with coastal development. On a very local scale, and the only significant factor of direct damage on our work site at Spurn is bait digging on the foreshore where the remaining seagrass meadow is. The seagrass is located now within a bylaw box, so this sort of activity has been reduced over the past 8 or 9 years or so. So just coming on to our efforts now, so you can see sort of where we're working. This is the species we're working with, Dwarf Eelgrass. It gets to about 6 inches or so in length. Doesn't tend to get much bigger than that. It's intertidal as opposed to Zostera marina, which tends to be subtidal. So if you can see seagrass and it's not underwater, you can pretty much guarantee it's going to be Dwarf Eelgrass. There isn't much overlap in the size either. This map here shows the extent of the Dwarf Eelgrass meadow at Spurn Point. In terms of decline, it has shrunk by about 95%. So a massive decline. This is a tiny little portion. I wish I'd put another map up to show you the sort of extent of it, where it was. This is a tiny portion that we have left now. But this line around the outside, so this is the area which is protected from bait digging. And since that was put in 2013, we have noticed basically the bed itself is denser, it's healthier, but it's struggling to get back upriver, if that makes sense. It's struggling to get past where it already is. Now, that is partly due to the hydrodynamics of the Humber estuary. Basically, seas just don't go back upriver to historic sites. They're really, really negatively buoyant, so they don't float very far. They tend to get trapped at the south end of the meadow, which is here. There's a lot of rocky shore down there, and it has, we've had historic human intervention, basically, back when it was under the control of the Ministry of Defence, which has basically meant that this area here, it's very, very difficult for any seas to get out, and it creates almost an eddy around here. So we sort of stepped in once we noticed that. We knew that we had a healthy bed. We knew that it wasn't declining further, but we wanted to step in to help it stray back a bit more to its historic extent. So thanks to a pilot funded by a very generous private donation, it led to us being funded by the GRCF, which is the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, for 2021 and 2022. We were able to show our pilot study that the methodology was sound, we knew it could work, and we just needed that extra boost to get it that little bit further out. This blue patch here is the area that we are currently replanting. And it's not just physically putting each plant in, which is allowing us to restore these areas. Seagrass binds substrate really well, and that basically will help seeds catch. So any seeds that disperse from up here can then start basically naturally planted around here. And if we try it further out as well, they should eventually start filling in these gaps that we're seeing. Fragmentation is a real issue when it comes to seagrass meadows. Just a note on the way that we are doing this. So it wouldn't be completely inaccurate to think of seed bombs. It's a very similar process. We have a biodegradable bag. In our case, we use Hessium, which contains a very small amount of donor substrate with the seed inside. This is the seed here, this tiny little blue dot that had just begun germinating when we were packing it. It's quite a low cost method in a way, as it mostly requires time and a small amount of resources to produce each bag, but it is very time consuming. It is very, 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 very much a case of getting as many people as possible to help with this as we can. The other way that we're doing it is we're taking it one step further. So rather than just dropping this small seed into the substrate, we're actually growing these on. So seedlings, they're quite a new idea, and they're our primary focus for the planting season in March 2022. It all starts off the same, exactly like that, but instead of planting them out, we give them a head start basically in tanks, so we can control the parameters, so we can concentrate on getting a really strong rhizome and fronds beginning to be produced before we then plant them out. I've already said the seeds have a massive mortality rate. It's up to about 95% mortality. The seeds are viable, they just get washed up onto the shore, washed onto inappropriate substrate, or even predated. Allowing us to do it like this, it just means that we can cut out that massive amount of mortality, and we can plant them where we want them as well. When it comes to that, we are planting at about one seedling bag per square meter. The idea behind this is because of that ability of seagrass to sort of extend their rhizomes about a meter or so from 50 centimeters from a central point, so a meter total. That basically gives us the ability to do the largest area possible with the fewest plants. That photo there is actually the very, very first one that went in at the start of this year. So that was the real start of the project. We are really lucky that we're working intertidally, because it means we have more options for planting than if we were to work with Zostra Mariner, where we would have to plan in dive times or snorkeling times, which wouldn't be quite as fun in the Humber as some of the nice clean Cornwall and Wales sites. Also, as we're working within a SSSI, there are strict rules on how much time we can spend working on the foreshore. And if we spend too long, the tide will come in and we'll get wet anyway. So we've gone for a very, very quick planting method, because we essentially looked at this and we were looking at it as a marine environment, but the method is a terrestrial system because we are going out on foot. So we use this tree planting tool. It's slightly different now. We have modified it very slightly so that we could let us plant to the depth required, basically, for the best seed success. In terms of time, we can plant 2 acres in a single low tide event with 4 people using these tools. So we know we can move very fast, and this has huge potential for increasing the scope of the project. Just note on where we are at the moment. We are sort of in the middle of the harvesting season, so we are going out onto the mudflats, onto the edge of the mudflats, taking any seeds and bringing them back, and we're bringing them on in our aquaculture system. I think it is my last slide. So thank you very much for listening to me today. I hope it's been enjoyable. I always tend to put these quotes up here because they are quite interesting to me. The 2 on the right were written by the author of a book on wildfowling, and it really highlights quite nicely the effects that every little organism has on the rest of the environment. I think if anyone's got any questions, I think now is the time, is it?
Andrew, can I just thank you so much for that? It was absolutely fascinating. I've learned loads. And Liam kept coming in and out, and he's very keen to talk to you about some of the things on the back of some of the things you've been talking about. So that's really super. And we've been through quite a lot of change at the Museums Trust over the last couple of years, and we've just developed some new strategic priorities, 5 new strategic priorities. One of those is environmental sustainability. So obviously this talk is fascinating within that context, and I'm sure we will have our conversation with you will continue as time goes by. And, we're very conscious that we're in a coastal location, and we feel a real obligation at the trust to participate in that preservation of our natural environment, and we work with a lot of schools, so we can, our outreach is quite extensive, and we really want to sort of start talking. So thank you so much for contributing to that debate. Absolutely. Really special. Now then, let's see if we can unmute people. so they can ask.
Hi, Claire. I've just started typing there, but I might as well turn my head. So I'm not sure whether it's directed to myself or not, but if it's for me, I've got a very varied background that started in aquatic horticulture. And basically just going into various aspects of conservation. I sort of volunteered within the Oyster project. I volunteered within the Seagrass project, and it led to the job through that avenue.
As I was just saying to Andrew, for me, my first sort of paleontological work was looking at Jurassic oysters on the Dorset coast, and I have therefore real kind of oyster interest. It's fascinating to hear what you're doing with modern oysters, but then, as you say, exploring that long history and the amazing work they do in creating habitats, and say in the seagrass in a similar way. So yeah, I think it's a really fascinating project and something to look forward to hearing more about it as it progresses.
I believe Liam knows how to contact me, so if he just wants to send the questions my way, no issues whatsoever.
So thank you all for coming. Andrew, thank you again for that fascinating talk. We really appreciate you participating in the Fossil Festival this year. It's been a real pleasure to have you. So without further ado, I'll end the session and wish you all well.
Great stuff. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.